The 2024 Summer Olympics are right around the corner, but it's already in the news because the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, has officially changed their transgender athlete policy. And this has led to a number of news reports stating that the IOC is banning trans athletes. While not technically true, it's pretty true in most cases. So I'll talk a little bit about that specific policy change because this is likely to have a broader impact on women's sports in general. But before we go there, you're probably wondering, how the heck did we even get here? So that's where we'll start. This all started when I was a wee lad in 2003, when the IOC said that trans athletes could compete, but only if they had a full sex reassignment surgery. As you might expect, this led to a groundswell of support among, we'll say, left-leaning individuals, claiming that it was a human rights violation and unfair, and that they should be allowed to compete. So the IOC came out with new guidance in 2015 that went as follows. Female to male athletes were basically allowed to compete without restriction with men. Pretty much a free-for-all. So where we're going to focus is the male to female category. Males must declare that their gender identity is female, step 1, and they cannot change that for sporting purposes for a minimum of 4 years. And obviously the Olympic cycles, summer to summer is 4 years, winter to winter is 4 years. So if an athlete is claiming that they are a female, they can't change it until pretty much after the next cycle. Number 2, they must demonstrate that their total testosterone level in serum has been below 10 nanomoles per liter for at least 12 months prior to competition. Now, for perspective, a quick Google search shows that men usually fall between 10 to 35 nanomoles per liter and women 0.5 to 2.4 nanomoles per liter. So, while this 10 would put them at the lower end of men, you're talking about 4 times the average woman as far as testosterone levels. And then that level must remain below 10 nanomoles per liter throughout the period of their desired eligibility if they want to compete. And if they refuse to test, then their eligibility for female competition will be suspended for 12 months. Now, there are some obvious complications with this. I could train as a male athlete for 20 years under this guidance, claim I'm a female, wait a year on hormone therapy, and then compete with women. Usain Bolt, a 6'5" male, could come out of retirement and say, actually, I have identified as a female this whole time, I've been living a lie, and my true identity is as a woman. Who could argue if that's his gender identity? Michael Phelps, who has a 6'7" wingspan, could say, you know what? I'm actually a woman, and if you disagree with me, you're a bigot. Tough to argue with that, right? So obviously this policy was way more lenient than it should have been, but it's what it was. There were only a couple Olympic athletes to note. You had a Canadian soccer player known as Quinn who won a gold medal in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics with the Canadian soccer team. Then you also had a weightlifter from New Zealand known as Laurel Hubbard, but he failed to complete a lift, so that was kind of a non-factor. But perhaps the bigger point is that this had a wide-ranging effect on women's sports. If the top organizations in the world are allowing it, who's to say that a high school athlete or a college athlete would not be allowed to compete? And so this is what you saw. For example, you had CC Telfer, who competed as a man in D2 track and field in 2016 and 2017. He was slipping as he got older. He was falling in the 200 to 400 range among male athletes. So he decided to transition to female, and he competed in 2019 after waiting his required year, and he won the 400-meter hurdles at the D2 Track and Field Championships. Perhaps more well-known was Leah Thomas, who shattered a bunch of swimming records and won at the D1 championship level.
Leah Thomas pulling away over the final 150 meters. Had to work for it. She was pushed over the first 350 meters. Thomas wins the NCAA championship. Ended up very close for second, with Wyatt taking it ahead of a late charge from Erica Sullivan in third.
And then what fewer people realize is this did trickle down into high school athletics, where you had a number of boys who, frankly, could not compete with their peers and decided to transition to women.
Kyle Gabinelli.
And that short shooter is the sound of the way, please.
Daniel in lane 2. You're going to see Gallagher later on in the relays. Great knees, great drive. Gallagher, the victory here in section number 1. 25:49.
Now let's pause for a second, because you may be wondering why or how this was allowed to happen among young adults and kids in high school. First, like I said, if the top organizations in the world are allowing it, who is to say that the high school and college guidance should not follow that? Second, consider what was happening in 2015. This was around the time that there was a lot of momentum behind increasing the amount of pay women athletes were receiving and increasing female opportunities in sports at large. And that came at the same time that this transgender movement was really starting to take hold among left-leaning individuals. And a lot of those same individuals truly believe that trans women are women. And if that is the case, naturally, they deserve to go into women's bathrooms, for example. They deserve to compete with other women in sports. And given that many American institutions, especially in education, are run by predominantly left-leaning individuals, this is what you got. This led to a lot of girls feeling unsafe and afraid to speak out. There are stories of girls who were told if they spoke out, they'd be kicked off their teams and lose their scholarships. Then there are also those girls who are just afraid of being canceled and labeled a transphobe and then missing out on other opportunities because of that. But there were some who did speak out.
What you do not know is the experiences of the women on the University of Pennsylvania swim team. My teammates and I were forced to undress in the presence of Leah, a 6'4" tall biological male, fully intact with male genitalia, 18 times per week. Some girls opted to change in bathroom stalls, and others used the family bathroom to avoid this. When we tried to voice our concerns to the athletic department, we were told that Leah's swimming and being in our locker room was a non-negotiable, and we were offered psychological services to attempt to re-educate us to become comfortable with the idea of undressing in front of a male. To sum up the university's response, we, the women, were the problem, not the victims.
The first race that I competed against a transgender athlete was during my freshman year. And once the gun went off, the two transgender athletes took off flying and left all of us girls in the dust. I knew right then and there that some girls would be missing out on great opportunities to succeed, and that women could be completely eradicated from their own sports.
What is it like to go into a competition against a transgender athlete when you know the outcome ahead of time?
Yeah, it's extremely deflating. I've experienced it 5 times, and each time I lost to a biological male. And the fact that that's still happening, that women are still losing to biological males in their own sport, shows why we need more female athletes to speak up about this.
All of this craziness has led to the changes we're seeing for the upcoming Olympics. The pendulum is swinging back. At the end of 2021, the IOC issued a new framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sex variations. Long story short, the IOC is allowing individual sporting bodies to decide whether trans athletes should be allowed to compete. They don't want to catch any more flack. For the Summer Olympics, there are over 30 different sporting bodies, and they fall under the ASOIF, which is the Association of Summer Olympic International Federations. And because this video will likely become outdated, I'll link this in the description below so that you can check out any individual sporting bodies that you're interested in. This also applies to the Winter Olympics as well as a few other sporting events. This is where we need to be a little bit more nuanced because each sporting body will be making their own policies. But a lot are using what track and field, swimming, and cycling are using, which is number 1, the athlete must declare that their gender identity is female, and number 2, they could not have experienced any part of male puberty either beyond Tanner stage 2 or after age 12. Basically, they are saying we don't want somebody who grew up as a man to then declare they're a female and compete with women. They're saying if you went through puberty, you are a man and you cannot compete with women. Obviously, if you're a policymaker, that is kind of sketchy because then you might have parents say, oh, well, my child is transgender, and that's a whole different discussion we're not going to have here. That aside, if they qualify under point 2, they then must maintain a testosterone level below 2.5 nanomoles per liter for as long as they would like to remain eligible, which is pretty much the upper end of the average female. Gymnastics currently does not have a policy, although they do have a Gender Equality Commission, but as stated by FIG, their governing body, the Commission's work is primarily based on the binary notion of gender and therefore focuses on empowering women and girls in the sport of gymnastics. So we're likely to see a similar restriction there. Women's soccer, we do not have a policy update, and if you remember, Quinn on the Canadian team, for example, they do allow trans athletes right now, so we'll see if that changes. Volleyball is a little bit unique. They're run by FIVB. Here, a player may change gender one time for purposes of eligibility and must pass a review by a gender eligibility committee where essentially they're going to look at that person and say, what's the nature of the change? What's their height? What's their weight? What's their muscle mass? What's their testosterone? And then that committee will decide on an individual basis whether an athlete should be allowed to compete. And then for teams of 2 or more, only one transgender athlete will be allowed. World Rugby has come out and banned it altogether. Their reasoning is that they don't want women being clobbered by men. And just the whole idea that you could have a man come in who went through male puberty, has all that extra mass, all that extra size, and just running over women. It's just not as safe. They're afraid about the hits they'd be taking or giving out in that case, and so they have completely banned it. For tennis, the ITF, the International Tennis Federation, states that 1, the player must identify as female, and then 2, they must stay under 5 nanomoles per liter for at least 12 months for as long as they would like to remain eligible. Now, that comes with some complications because the WTA and the ATP, the main professional tennis organizations, may have different policies, but that is what will be the policy for the Olympics. For the triathlon, athletes must declare that their gender identity is female. And then number 2, they must stay under the 2.5 nanomoles per liter for at least 24 months, and then for as long as they'd like to remain eligible, and they could not have competed as a male within the past 4 years. Now for the combat sports like wrestling, taekwondo, all of those, I couldn't find any updated policies, so be on the lookout for those. All I could really find was wrestling, and they had the same policy from 2016, that 10 nanomoles per liter for 12 months, and so I would expect that to probably change, but we'll see. Weightlifting was similar. I couldn't find any official updates for the 2024 Olympics from the IWF, although there were reports that I found stating they're creating open gender categories for their other events. So maybe we'll see something like that for the Olympics. I don't think they'd have an open gender event, but who knows? We'll find out. With all of that said, you got to remember, it has been a long, long road for women to be able to compete in sports, let alone at the international stage. It wasn't even until about 2000 that women accounted for about 40% of total Olympic athletes. Many countries just didn't allow their women to compete, and even those that did not have many events that they could send their female athletes to. For example, women's soccer, which is huge now, wasn't even in the Olympics until 1996. That's literally 96 years after men's soccer was introduced to the Olympics. And after all of that, they finally get their footing on the world stage, and they have to compete with men identifying as women taking hormones. Like, come on, just let the women compete. And to everyone that's going to complain about these new rules, transgender athletes can still compete. Yeah, it's going to be a lot rarer. Compete with the men. But excluding them from women's competitions is really the only realistic, safe, and fair policy to adopt. You might not like it, but life isn't fair. If I could choose, I'd be a 6'5" guy, and I would be competing in the Olympics. But that's not my reality. Competing in the Olympics is not a right. So let the women who have trained at the highest level for their entire lives compete on a fair playing field against other women. That's all I have to say about that. But like I was saying, these policies are likely to change, so I'm going to link the different federations in the description below, and you can check that out for the Summer Olympics, Winter Olympics, and then a few other sporting events. That all aside, I know I'm not speaking for everybody, but I'm at least looking forward to a fun Olympics this year. And go Team USA!